So there are also a lot of challenges in faculty-student partnerships, and they're really the same as the benefits, right? That people are coming from different perspectives, and so faculty we live in our world about what we think is going on in terms of our planning and in terms of what we hope the ways that students will take up courses. Students come with a completely different perspective and set of assumptions and hopes, and rarely are those shared. And so at first, when faculty and students get together, there can be a kind of a clash of perspectives and of understanding of what the work of teaching and learning is and could be. And so initially, it's as though they're not really in the same space, like they're not really doing the same work, and so there has to be a bridging between experiences and hopes and expectations of faculty and students. So a main challenge is realizing that's not insurmountable. I mean that you are in fact in the same space and have similar goals, even if there is a range of what those goals might be. So a challenge is how can you find language to connect with one another, and not to say that you have the same experience, but so that you understand where the other is coming from.
One of the things that Alison says to us when we start is that it's emotional, that working as a student consultant and working with a faculty partner is an emotional strain, and also, I mean, you're forming a close relationship with someone, and you go through a lot of cycles within that. So it's a vulnerable making process for the professors and for the students. I know for me, I've definitely struggled with how to say things in the right way, how to say things without offending people, how to translate things when I'm seeing a struggle going on in the classroom, when things aren't being communicated in the way that students or faculty members want them to. It's a struggle for me because I feel so invested in the class and I want things to go right. So in that way, I don't think I expected it to be as emotional as it is. And I don't think I expected to be so emotionally invested in what my faculty partners are doing and how they're feeling about the whole process.
This kind of partnership and this sort of program is really, it really puts you in a vulnerable spot because as well as for the professor who's sort of handing over almost, part of their classroom to the student consultant, you're also sort of expected to use your own experience to give back to the program and help the professors or support the professors in any way that they see fit. So it does put you in a spot where you're required to sort of put yourself out there.
One thing I face a lot is this kind of resistance or the resistance of changing things happening in the classroom, which is terrifying for both students and professor. I mean, every time when I encounter a faculty thinking about having or designing some new activities, they will think about how students will react and will they understand why I'm doing this, or will that take up too much time, or those kind of thinking are very complicated. And on the student side, I can also see why students are kind of worried about those changes. I don't really know what I can get out from this activity. It's not what we usually do in class. So communication becomes key in this process. Like faculty, it's really important that faculty inform students about why he or she is going to do this activity, and to make sure he or she provides enough guidance to guide students through this process.
In terms of challenges in relationships with TLI consultants, I don't think the challenges have ever had much to do with them. I think they always have a lot more to do with me. It's a very sort of raw experience to have someone not only in your class every day tracking what's happening, but it's also someone who's been really well trained to do that very constructively, but also very perceptively. And so it forces you to really sort of confront what's actually going on in your class. And sometimes that's really positive. And I think one of the most productive things for me in having a TLI consultant there was that I have in the past wasted a lot of energy kind of self-lacerating myself over all the things I was sure weren't working. then I would find out at the end of the semester that actually it had been pretty effective. And I found that the TLA consultant was able to give me that positive feedback much faster, so I could focus my energies on actually doing constructive things and not just feeling lousy about my course, which was actually going fine. So I think that there's a positive side to that, but I think the challenge of it is that it then really forces you to think seriously about the things that actually aren't working, which are sometimes more deep-rooted and really kind of intersect with more fundamental challenges that you have in teaching or even in your own sort of intellectual approach to things. And so I think, in my experience, both the TLA consultants I worked with were really able to get at these deeper-rooted things, and that was really helpful. I mean, it was hard to deal with, but it was helpful.
One of the challenges is that it necessitates an ongoing process for strengthening relationships. And I don't think that's something that we need to do as much when we aren't integrating student voices. I mean, even if we're co-authoring with colleagues, there's a kind of definitive place and you work out a process for writing together. But it isn't the same kind of relationship building. And so I think that's a particular challenge. I think there's another challenge in engaging a lot of student voices and not just the high achievers, the ones in student government, the leaders, and trying to get a real range of student voices. I think that's a challenge. And of course, sustaining the voices is an ongoing challenge. What is it that's going to sustain in a time when students are economically stressed and, of course, time, they're busy. We need to be able to provide something that's going to sustain them over time. Of course, it's also a challenge that they don't stay with us forever, and that's always something I resent when they decide to graduate. But it is part of the challenge of it, I think, too. I think those are the main ones that I would say.
I want to be able to have the same discussions I'm having with my own professors that I'm having with my faculty partners. And because you have to build up a relationship to that, it's hard for me to sit and think, I want to be able to tell them if they did this activity or if we had a little bit more time to discuss, or if we had more silence, or if we had any of these things, maybe the discussion would go a different way, or people would feel more confident speaking. And it's hard to go to someone who's never had that experience and say that to them, or to even build up to that. So one of the challenges for me has been figuring out how I can share the knowledge and the kind of confidence that I'm gaining in this partnership with other professors who aren't used to this at all.
A challenge is that I've got to be, ready and thoughtful for the meetings. I've got to articulate what I'm trying to accomplish. The more you articulate, the better, the more you're going to get out of the conversation and what the student has to offer. You have to be prepared to face up to one's deficiencies, right? They're going to point out things that you're doing that you probably wish you weren't doing.
Some of the challenges with integrating student voices, well, I think one of the biggest ones is that just people don't have enough time. There's not enough time to do all the wonderful things that people want to do, to try out all the new ideas. What I find is that you have all these really interested people, but interested, engaged people are often already interested, engaged in other things. They're already very busy, very active in different committees, different clubs, etc. And so finding the time, and my suggestion in terms of combating that is always building in more ways so that you get credit, so that it counts for something. So something I talked about earlier this morning is that for students, it's offering them credit, it's offering them pay. For faculty, I would argue the same thing. Money is always a wonderful incentive, it's always a nice benefit, and especially awards and titles, so that it's not just this thing that you do on the side that you volunteer for, it's actually something that is recognized. So your time really does count.
The challenge that I found myself facing was then having to adapt the course in response to these questions that students were raising or issues students were having. And in both cases, I, kind of put myself to task to make a substantial response and to make real changes in the courses. But that was really hard. And I think for me, it got at the really deep-rooted issue that TLI and these consultant relationships really lays bare, which is that it really forces you to confront what you consciously and unconsciously are thinking about power in your class, like who holds power and what that power is, and how power will and won't be negotiated. And it just forced me to be really honest about that. I think I'm interested in power as a sort of intellectual concept and also as like a fact of experience, but it was really different to be the one under the microscope, or to be putting myself under the microscope, in terms of whether the way I was exercising power and negotiating power with my students was or wasn't actually consistent with what I claim to myself that I believe about that.
Some of the challenges that I faced coming in my freshman year, after freshman year, was that I wasn't sure whether I was prepared for something like this. And I wasn't sure what it meant like to go into a classroom and work with a professor and analyze what was going on in the class, because I'm not an education, doing an education minor or certification. And I'm also a science major. So, and I tended to think of that as being either social science or humanities field. So that was a challenge coming in. But over the years, I realized it's also, it's good to be a student, basically, and that's sort of the capital that I bring into the class. And with that, I tend to go into a class, how would I feel as a student doing some of the things that are happening? And so I may not necessarily understand the content, which is sort of another challenge that you have to come through. One is thinking, do I need to understand what's actually being taught in the class to be able to analyze how students are dealing with the material? And so learning that as a student, there are certain things that you can actually observe without necessarily understanding the content is something that has been really helpful over the last couple of semesters that I've done this.